January deer hunting rules. You know, how many of you are in hunting out there? January is an awesome time of the hunt, and I can openly admit that I've been able to hunt in January quite a bit, but it really, my time starts to get limited going into January. We have our first client trips, but man, there's so much opportunity, and I really appreciate when Wisconsin went to the end of January so you could still hunt with a bow for an extra month. I really like that, but a lot of those states out there you cannot. Most states you can't. There's some really good doe opportunity. It's a great time to harvest does. You're harvesting them for next year, which is a really cool thing. So you're just looking at it in reverse. If you need to really lower doe numbers, you can do that in January. So awesome time to do so. It's at a time where you're not spooking deer to your neighbors, getting them shot. You're not hurting your buck age structure. You're not hurting your sex ratios. Really good time to get out there, and they're bunched up, and we're going to talk about that. You know, one of the cool things I've seen in January, I can remember early January, it was going back maybe 6 or 7 years, I was able to experience open scrapes, lots of bucks and does chasing. One of our monsters at that time, I remember it chased a doe right down in front of me, and it was a little fawn doe, and a lot of those come in later, and it came right down in front of me, and when I thought the buck would follow it, the buck made a deep grunt. It had come in breaking brush, making scrapes all the way in the snow. It was really cool. And when it grunted, the doe just took off, and it cut the angle and just went back after it, and I never saw it again. I was that close to shooting a really nice buck that year. But, you know, that's how the way it goes. But I've seen that on client properties even in early February, Wisconsin. And you can really look at those areas and say, man, there's probably some really high doe numbers in those particular spots. And you'll see it on properties that are very poorly managed. And what I mean by that is if you have excessive doe numbers, you have lots of summer food, you build giant doe properties where when you go in, you spook bucks, you spook those mature bucks, those does and fawns will stick around. And all of a sudden you have a pile of does and fawns on the property. Mature bucks like to live elsewhere, and buck herd in general, because there's less stress on other properties, and all of a sudden you have does that are missed, and that contributes to that second, third. Now people say, well, there's not a second rut even, and really, again, those northern lakeshore properties, those northern Lake Superior, for example, if those bucks breed does a month later, so a second rut, a third rut, those fawns are born late, they go into the following fall too small, and then they have harsh winters in those environments, in those areas, those regions, and they probably die. So over time, the primary rut has been really condensed in those areas. I think John Azoga, he's a deer research biologist up in Munising, Michigan, in that area. That's where he studied deer for his entire career with the state of Michigan. He observed that up there. It's a very tight breeding window, but he acknowledged that that's not probably reflective of other areas. And you could read that, some of his quotes that he has. And so when you get into most of Wisconsin, most of Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, all over Indiana, Illinois, southern Michigan, over into Pennsylvania, you get to experience a second rut. And then we're talking about these areas down in the southern areas, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, where you can start your ruts in November, December, and you could have a rut every month for a few months, because those deer do not have to be born within this very tight window to survive in those locations. So completely different story in those areas. But really, I feel bad for some people out there when you talk about there's no second rut, there's no third rut, because those people have such a limited experience watching deer. And I think that's a hunting industry in general. You can watch a lot of YouTube channels out there. People are only familiar with their own little world. For example, a deer enclosure where you have really even sex ratios. You're going to see all the breeding take place almost at one time, but a 1-to-1 sex ratio is not reflective of the majority of the country. So when you see those things taking place, and then people talk about those observations in their limited world, it's really unfortunate because people miss out. And that's one of the reasons we have this channel, is we don't want to see people miss out. So there is a second rut, there is a third rut, and if you have enough experience hunting, if you have enough experience hunting multiple states, public, private land, if you have enough experience with clients even, I've seen 1,700 clients almost. So when you have enough clients, you talk to enough hunters out there, you have enough experience, which experience trumps everything, then you'll see that second and third rut, and it's really important for you to understand that. Now, how do you hunt the second and third rut? We're really looking for those really good cruising zones, but we're still focusing on the afternoon and evening. You can, those morning hunts, you have an opportunity, but I never want to go in on a morning hunt, even if I suspect a third rut in early January, even a fourth rut in early February, which is a very small percentage of rutting activity. But I never want to go in to those time periods in the morning and mess up a good afternoon hunt. So those afternoons really rules. Winter grounds are critically important. And what I mean by that is during the winter and even late fall, those times really rule. And we'll talk about stockpiling. But if you have good winter grounds, meaning you have good hardwood regeneration, you have good stem count, you have good shrubs, you have good winter food sources, then does it make sense if you have great habitat in January, February, March, outside of a deer yard, it's all conifer, and even then that's lacking. It's a green barn. There's not a lot of food. Deer are forced in those areas in northern regions. But outside of those northern deer yard areas where deer travel 15, 20 miles or more sometimes to get to a deer yard, if you have winter cover and deer are hanging out, that means you have good browse, you have good thermal protection. It means it can't be all conifer because it's not good browse. But you have what it takes not only for winter grounds, but fall grounds too. Now, if deer are there just because of some giant winter food source and it's still standing, you have the only food in the area, that's a little bit different story too, but in harsh environments, they still need thermal protection. So great winter grounds also equal great fall grounds, and you'll see both of those together. And so it's a really telling tale if you have a lot of deer during the winter as to how your fall will go too. So really pay attention to that. When you have that great fall and winter habitat, what's really cool about that is you're going to notice that you'll start to stockpile deer. So you might even have good areas of fall habitat where you have a little bit here, 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 decent properties that are holding deer. They get some pressure, they lose some food sources, they don't have any thermal protection, areas that deer can get out of the wind in the harsh environment. So what do? Here's this winter area right here. They start moving towards those stockpile areas. They move toward their winter grounds, and that's where they hole up. Now, I want to be that person that has that all the time, but really, you're focusing on the fall. And it's hard to have great fall habitat without having great winter habitat, and so you can really start to stockpile deer. And what I mean by that, as long as you don't spook them out, as long as the food stays constant, the quality of the cover, meaning the diversity, thermal protection, where you're not getting that ultimate wind blowing right in. Deer really have to be concerned with how much wind that they're taking. Summer facing or south facing slopes, that's kind of cool. But think about this, you might have a time where the temperatures dip from 25 degrees to daytime highs in the single digits. And those deer will get out of the wind. It might all of a sudden come back around, you have high winds out of the southwest or south, and it's 15 degrees. You actually warmed up. That's what the south winds brought. They need to get out of the wind. So they'll be on the north-facing slopes, regardless of the sun, just to get out of the wind. So look for those pockets of protected cover, and we'll even see that out here in the hills where deer will move from one side of the ridge to the other, depending on the winds and where they're blowing from, irregardless of the sun, because deer that are sitting in the sun at 15 degrees with 25-mile-an-hour winds, right in their noses, they'll get frostbite ears, they get energy zapped from their bodies, they can't afford to lose energy at those times. And really a lot of times that boils down to inexperienced does with fawns. You'll find fawns that get their ears frostbit out, and that was just poor maternal instincts for where they bed and what type of habitat they're choosing. So when you find it, they'll stockpile, and that's a really cool thing, especially as a hunter in January. Afternoons rule. Like I said, there could be some morning rut activity, but you really want to pay attention to those afternoons because they're hitting those food sources. They need to build energy, conserve energy, and that's what it's all about with that winter cover too, and that thermal protection. So it's really important to hunt those afternoons. I'm not saying you don't have some morning activity or some morning opportunity, but never go into a morning stand location where traditional rutting takes place if you know a mature buck is going to hit this food source in the afternoon relating to that bedding area and you have a chance of spooking them. Always remember this time of year, typically those bucks aren't a mile away, just actively cruising, looking for does all night. Instead, they're staying in this little honey hole window. They're not making great big movements because they want to conserve energy. So when you go in the morning, a lot of times they're already in those bedding areas, even if they're going to exhibit a little bit of rutting behavior. It means don't be as aggressive, and it might even mean that not being aggressive means only hunting afternoons, but afternoons are premium this time of year. They're on the way to food, and as long as you can keep from spooking out that food source. I'm not advocating you go into a giant food plot or a standing cornfield and spook all the deer out unless it's your last hunt for the year. But what I'm advocating is hunting that food source, deer on the way there, small food source on the way to a big food source, a funnel area, maybe a swamp edge where you have thick cover on the way to that food source. Great spots to hunt during the afternoon, and that way you can preserve that food source, keep it going, keep stockpiling. And then finally, weather will guide you to success all season long. And what we see this in December too. When the weather moderates, you see those deer start to spread out. We still have a lot of cameras running in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And when we see the weather moderating and the snow melts, last year we had dust in January and February here in southeast Minnesota. When we see that taking place, those deer tend to spread back out. They don't like to be cramped into each other, right on top of each other like traditional deer yard areas or winter grounds. They want to spread out. So when the weather moderates, look for them spreading out, and that'll give you a little bit more opportunity in more locations. Maybe even see that all the deer on your neighbors, you had a good fall, all the deer on the neighbors right now into a standing food source, all of a sudden the weather moderates. They don't need to hit those grains as hard. You'll see that even in warm years. We have people that have a lot of grains like bean and corns, and in 2024, in April, March, people were brush hogging their corn and beans down because we had a really warm winter and they didn't have to hit grain. They were really spread out. That's why we found a lot more sheds last year than the year before. We found a lot more than our neighbors only because we have a lot of green. We didn't have as much grain. We have a little bit of corn. But those deer stayed more in their traditional fall grounds instead of needing to have that necessity to actually consume and build energy on those grains and stay in one spot. So look for that moderate. So when you see those temperatures changing, at the same time when you see those heavy snows, then they'll really stockpile, and it all boils down to high quality thermal protection, diversity, and then an afternoon food source. And that's where they can really stockpile. And so look for that weather change. You know, we always hunt by the weather, but look for that weather change. You can hunt on January 20th. This is your time you can hunt. You have no other weekend. And so you're saying, I'm going to go in here and it's warm. Look for them spreading out, maybe some more traditional November movements or late October movements. And if it gets really cold, cheat towards those hardcore winter habitats where there's a lot of diversity, maybe briar, shrub tips, hardwood regeneration, maybe a little bit of hills where deer can get out of the wind, or conifer cover mixed in. And then a great standing food source is always a plus. And we encourage anybody with private land to try to make sure they have food lasting as long as possible. It's not possible for a lot of people, but if you can and you can find that, it can be a great spot to hunt. You know, we hunt by the weather all season long. And sometimes you look at the weather's perfect, you go sit this stand and hunt or not. But when it comes down to January, just get out and understand that roller coaster of where deer might be and where they're not during January based on the weather and those warm-ups or those really good downturns of a severe winter weather. And you'll be on track in January. And, you know, let's face it, if that winter cover holds and you're stockpiling deer, we'll talk about looking for sheds in those same areas middle of February, early February. It varies greatly. You'll see those northern regions where things are lacking, they'll drop their antlers a little bit sooner. And then more southerly areas. Our key time around here, I wouldn't want to shed hunt before end of February, early March, and that's what we're waiting for. But it's that same winter cover that you'll find great deer hunting in January. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. You're our best followers. You followed all the way to the end of the video. Really invite you to check out our website. We have our earthway spreaders for sale, great Christmas presents. We're booking clients right now, all 5 of us. So by the end of December, it seems early, but by the end of December, our schedule will be booked for 2025. It's hard to believe. I'm already booked for December and most of January, February. We have our web classes, the rut web class, how to design your whitetail property, and really important, hunting hills and thermals, understanding the wind. Those are great products on our site, all the books. Thank you so much for watching all the videos, buying the seed that you did this year. Really appreciate you.